Omar Bauder, thank you so much for joining me. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much. Always good to be with you.
All right, so we got a lot to talk about. So just to catch everybody up, of course, Israel recently killed a top Hezbollah leader in Beirut, Lebanon. That was a huge deal, basically crossing a bright red line. Hezbollah had previously said, look, if you attack Beirut, it's on. Then you have a top Hamas leader who's part of the political wing, not the military wing. He was killed in Tehran by Israel. Again, Israel crossing a big, big, bright red line. And at first, after that, we hear it's inevitable. There's going to be an attack from Iran, right? And they're making a lot of noise about that. I've seen a lot of videos around that. You have the Grand Ayatollah tweeting some very cryptic things, which you look at and you're like, oh my God, there's about to be another colossal war in the Middle East that spirals here. So let me start with this. Let me ask you this. So I've now read a couple different things about what people think will happen. I've read one thing that said, hey, Iran has left the door open to maybe do some sort of special forces operation. They've left that on the table. I've read that Iran is potentially offering not to attack Israel back if they agree to a permanent ceasefire in Gaza. And I've read that Iran is just basically biding their time and dotting their I's and crossing their T's and trying to prepare for a big attack on Israel. Which one of those things do you think is most likely?
Yeah, I mean, it's a little bit of the last two. I think it is definitely true that a ceasefire would get us out of the mess that we're currently in. From the very beginning, it's been clear that the reason why what is described as the axis of resistance is involved in this at all is to try to end the genocide in Gaza. And they've been very careful to apply military pressure, but measured and gradual military pressure rather than diving into some kind of big war, because all they're trying to do is try to push Israel to agree to end this slaughter in Gaza. And so if that slaughter were to come to an end, I think that you would see an immediate diffusion. You would diffuse the situation basically with both Iran and Lebanon and Hezbollah there. But that, frankly, does not seem very likely. And the power that both Iran and Hezbollah bring to the table, it's in their arsenal of rockets. So the prospect of some kind of special forces operation in Israel seems pretty far-fetched to me. It's not what those particular forces bring to the table. It is Israeli special forces and Israeli intelligence, the Mossad, and these kinds of covert assassinations that they do. That is their bread and butter. That is what they're good at. And so there is a kind of an imbalance in what each side brings to the table. And so I would have bet on some kind of rocket response from either Hezbollah or from Iran having already taken place, hitting targets in Israel that would be different from the ones that they've hit so far, something more meaningful and more substantial to kind of meet the magnitude of the assault that Israel has engaged in both Beirut and Tehran. But it's funny, Kyle, because I think that you have the U.S., what they did in the meantime seemed paradoxical. In one way, they've acted in a way that is incredibly pathetic and shows that the U.S. lacks power, but in another way, also incredibly intimidating. They have mobilized the U.S. military. They've sent something like a dozen destroyers to the region, 4,000 Marines off the coast of Israel. And they made it clear to Iran that the U.S. is ready to jump into a war if one were to break out from Iranian retaliation, while at the same time pleading with Iran to not fall into Netanyahu's trap. That's apparently what was conveyed through intermediaries, saying that Netanyahu is trying to push for a regional war and we need to do everything we can to not fall into Netanyahu's trap. And it's kind of odd because you would think that a superpower, rather than plead with an adversary not to fall into Netanyahu's trap, would actually rein in the client state that is engaging in provocations that are clearly aimed towards a regional explosion, which Netanyahu sees as his way out of this entire mess. It's a very, very bizarre dynamic where the U.S. is simultaneously conveying the threat of force that I think did intimidate both Hezbollah and Iran into not responding immediately, because the prospect of a full-scale war with the United States is not something to be taken lightly. And on the other hand, also showing that the Biden administration remains deferential to Netanyahu and talking in this kind of inevitable way of the U.S. being dragged in, kicking, screaming, having to defend Israel, even though they know that Israel is the one that is actually provoking this regional conflict that the U.S. actually does not want.
But, okay, so here's my question then. Is it a bluff from the United States? Because Look, when the U.S. went to the war in Afghanistan, that was directly after 9/11, and there was peak hysteria and mania and war fever in this country. But they had to build up the argument to go to Iraq in 2003. 2 years later, and it required a lot of propaganda, and it was incredibly sustained, and they basically lied and duped the American people into thinking, hey, we have to go after Saddam Hussein. He worked with Al-Qaeda. He has weapons of mass destruction. We don't want the evidence of his weapons to come in the form of a mushroom cloud. But in this instance, I can't help but think the American public would be like, are you fucking kidding me? We're going to go to war with Iran because Israel and Netanyahu, they're a rabid dog in the region, attacking anybody and everybody and carpet bombing children on a regular basis. So my question for you is it possible it's a bluff from the U.S.? Because somewhere deep down, Biden has to know and Kamala Harris has to know. If we go to war for Israel against Iran right now, we're tanking the election. We're going to lose the election to Trump.
Yeah. I think, look, we've had this divide between what the American people think and what the elite conversation on many, many different topics. And I think this is one of them. I think what you're describing is absolutely correct. Americans would be absolutely outraged with the idea of the U.S. being engaged in a full-scale war on behalf of Netanyahu. That's an outrage. And yet, when you look at where the political conversation is right now between the Republicans and the Democrats, they're competing over who's going to be more pro-Netanyahu in this moment. That's what they're competing for. And so you have politicians who are stuck in a very outdated mindset. You have constantly, we can probably talk about it a little bit also in relation to Kamala Harris and her VP pick and all that. You have constantly the Republicans painting Democrats as anti-Semitic and anti-Israel. And you constantly have the Democrats fighting tooth and nail to prove that they're not, by being more and more pliant towards whatever Netanyahu wants them to do, and actually just basically following him and following his lead on everything and refusing to apply meaningful pressure on him. And so within that dynamic, I'm not entirely sure whether Biden would actually pull the trigger if Israel is in a full-scale war and he felt that this is what this political moment needs. If Trump starts baiting him and talking about how Biden is leaving our ally to fend for themselves in the middle of this threat and not intervening, whether that could build enough pressure for Biden to actually intervene. So who knows whether this is actually a bluff or something that could materialize in terms of reality. It certainly is too high a risk for either Iran or Hezbollah to basically take a chance and roll the dice on that. You know, every war that the U.S. has lost, they've lost in the long term. When you talk about being in Afghanistan for 20 years and then eventually pulling out, or being in Vietnam, that kind of thing still utterly devastates those countries in the meantime. So Iran being relatively stable right now is not eager for the prospect in which the country gets decimated just because 20 years down the road they might successfully drive the Americans out or something. Still, the cost would be incredibly high in terms of the decimation of major cities, both in Iran and in Lebanon.
So if the U.S. knows and the administration knows that Netanyahu is a rabid dog based on, you know, the stuff that they're saying to Iran, like, hey, man, this guy's crazy, don't fall for his trap, right? Then I can't, it's hard for me to wrap my mind around this idea that they've still done absolutely nothing to rein him in. I mean, it would literally only take, just like with Ronald Reagan when Israel was attacking Lebanon, it would literally just take a phone call. So how are we not at that point yet? I can't get my mind around it.
Yeah, it's honestly nothing short of infuriating that Netanyahu is playing Biden like a fiddle at this point. You've had, all the Biden administration has done is plead with Netanyahu about the need for a ceasefire. Then they leaked to Axios that finally Biden is coming to terms with the fact that Netanyahu is lying about wanting a deal. Clearly, he doesn't want one, and supposedly had a tough conversation with him about how we expect a ceasefire within 2 weeks or whatever. I mean, again, it's just how pathetic and impotent do you look as the regional superpower that is actually, the best you can do is leak to the press that you're having tough conversations with Netanyahu and that you're really mad at him, instead of doing the obvious leverage that you do have, which is cutting off military funding for Israel until Netanyahu falls in line and does what the U.S. wants him to do. And that's a line that, again, I think Biden is not willing to cross, either because of his personal deep attachment to Israel and the feeling that you can't do that to a country he feels that strongly about, or because of his sense that in domestic politics, this is unprecedented and it has an unpredictable impact on the electorate, and therefore he's afraid to take that step. But I mean, I don't know, at some point you just have to, you know, grow a pair and actually do something, because at this point it is looking incredibly pathetic and stupid for the United States to be put in this position where they're constantly pleading with a smaller client country that is engaged in the worst human rights abuses imaginable. They are on full display committing genocide, massacring children by the tens of thousands, running rape camps and their torture camps for Palestinian detainees, and where government officials are defending that rape. That's the country and government that you're talking about. And that you still can't pull the plug on this unlimited and unconditional military funding is utterly insane. It just does not gel with America's strategic position in the world, if you're looking at it specifically from that angle, or American morality and standing. If you're going to be a country that's going to pretend to stand up for human rights and for democracy and freedom and all of that, to be backing a government that is engaged in this kind of violence, it's utterly horrific. And you're absolutely right. There ought to be a change in American policy, but just it's difficult to look at this current landscape in which AIPAC is successfully defeating members of the Squad that are in opposition to Israeli policy and American support for it, and to kind of speculate about what the ultimate final outcome. It is political cowardice and lack of backbone at the end of the day that the administration is unable to evolve with a new situation, and they're insisting on playing it safe. And in their dumb minds, playing it safe means keeping that blank check going, when in my view, that's the biggest risk you can possibly take coming into an election in which there is very, very significant opposition to what Israel is doing that is on full display for the entire world to see.
Yeah, and by the way, there is now video proof of rape being done by the IDF at their concentration camps. We now have video proof of that. So let me ask you this. I read that the heads of the Israeli intelligence agencies are annoyed with Netanyahu, and they know for sure he doesn't want a deal. Is it just ass covering on their part, or is that real? Like, are those reports real, or is it similar to when, like, with the Biden administration, you have some people around him who were like, they really disagree on the direction he's going, but they're not going to do shit about it?
Yeah, no, in this case, I do think it's real. It's obvious that the only person who benefits from a lack of a deal at this point is Netanyahu himself. This is about his personal legacy. If he were to do what needs to be done, which is come to terms with the fact that you have failed, you could not retrieve the hostages militarily, you could not defeat Hamas, and the only thing left right now is to strike a deal and end the bloodshed that is leading to more and more Israeli isolation. The only person who doesn't want to do that is Netanyahu, because he does not want to be the person on whose watch all of this happened, this massive failure has taken place. That will be his legacy, in addition to the prospect of him going to prison because of corruption as well, the second that this war ends. But you have, to me, the timing is interesting, that all this has happened immediately after Netanyahu came to Washington. And you wonder what conversations took place. We can speculate what the conversation with Kamala Harris and Biden was, which is basically more of the same. Please try to come to a deal. We urge you to do more, blah, 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 all that stuff. But at the end of the day, we have your back, so you don't have anything to worry about. But what conversations did he have that encouraged him to immediately go back and launch this strike on Beirut and then carry out an assassination of Tehran? You wonder what conversations may have happened with Republicans, with when he met with Trump, what kind of encouragement towards escalation that they felt pretty confident would either squeeze Biden in a position where he would have to support it, or from the dumb perspective of Republicans, but yet able to convince Democrats to go along, that this would apply enough pressure that if Biden were not to back Israel in a regional war, that this somehow increases the chances of Republicans winning that election on account of being somehow more pro-Israel and more willing to go farther than Democrats do.
So last time we had an Iranian response to Israeli aggression, they did a rocket attack that was basically like a virtue signal attack. And I say that because there was massive warning in advance, and they went for targets that they knew there wouldn't be casualties. And it was basically kind of like a warning shot. Like, look, we're letting you know our capabilities are better than you think they are, and we're not going to sit here and just take whatever you want to do to us, right? Do you think it's possible that we get like another sort of virtue signal strike, for lack of a better term, which sends the message without actually having Israel retaliate? Or is it now, even if they do a virtue signal strike, then Netanyahu's going to still unleash open the gates of hell?
Yeah, I think we're in a situation right now where Iran and frankly Hezbollah as well, which, by the way, I think Hezbollah's response is still imminent, But I think what they are trying to figure out right now is specifically how to thread that needle, how to respond in a way that seems meaningful, that it meets the magnitude of the moment, but does not open the door for Netanyahu to basically launch an all-out war and drag the U.S. into it. And that's a very difficult thing to do precisely because of what you said, Kyle, because the last strike was a virtue signal strike. It was just saying, hey, we can do this, but being careful not to cause any casualties. If they do a repeat of that simply, then Iran looks even more impotent, that no matter what happens, this is the extent to which they're willing to go, is just respond symbolically. I think there is significant pressure on both Iran and Hezbollah to respond in a way that is more meaningful. And the question is, how do you do that? How do you do it in a way that is meaningful and impactful, but still does not open the door to an all-out war? Frankly, I think that is the only reason we have not seen those responses take place yet, is because they are trying to calibrate that response. From the perspective of both Iran and Hezbollah, they are winning the long game in a way. They think that every day longer that this goes on, either Israel is sinking itself deeper and deeper into a mess that it can't get itself out of and suffering a very significant public relations toll, basically, the damage of what they're actually doing in Gaza and everywhere else is still climbing. The economic damage is climbing. The number of wounded soldiers in Gaza is climbing. So in a way, they're content keeping this as a war of pressure, ultimately. But at the same time, they have to draw certain lines so that Netanyahu does not feel empowered to do whatever the hell he wants in Beirut and in Tehran. And they have to draw a line somewhere to say that there are lines, if you cross them, then we are on the road to escalation. And in a way, Hezbollah was confident that this thing is not going to escalate into an all-out war. If you heard Nasrallah speak multiple times, he kept having that assurance that this is not going to go into a fallout war, based on the idea that because both sides have effectively mutually assured destruction, surely nobody's going to cross any red lines. They know what the outcome of an all-out war would be. It is mass devastation in Israel, mass devastation in Lebanon. And in a way, I think Hezbollah is flabbergasted that Israel was willing to cross a red line in light of that. Netanyahu is basically saying he does not mind if you have mass devastation in both countries. And Hezbollah, in a way, wants to be more responsible than that. They know that this would be the outcome. They don't know what the long-term implications of that, and they're trying to have Lebanon avoid that kind of devastation. So they are, I'm almost certain that there is imminently going to be a Hezbollah response, just because when they commit to responding, they never back down from their commitments. Again, this is about their credibility. And I think all what we're seeing right now is a waiting game to try to figure out how you thread that needle and respond in a way that is bigger than just a symbolic virtue signal strike, but also stops short of the threshold that would allow Netanyahu to justify launching a full-scale war.
Yeah, so let's game this out. What are the implications if Iran does respond, and Hezbollah will throw them in there too, and if Iran and Hezbollah don't respond? Because from where I'm sitting, if both Iran and Hezbollah, let's say for argument's sake, they just don't do anything, which I don't think is really on the table, but let's say for argument's sake that's the case, the message that sends to Netanyahu is, you can do whatever the fuck you want in Beirut. You can do whatever the fuck you want in Tehran. You can kill whoever you can kill a member of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard in Tehran. And hey, we already showed you we're not going to do it when you assassinated one of our guests, one of the top Hamas political wing leaders. So if they do nothing, that message is honestly intolerable for any nation state, right? But then if they do something, I mean, I know Netanyahu is insane. So is that going to lead to, he's like, fuck it, press the red button, right? Like, bye-bye Beirut, bye-bye Tehran. Is that real? Are we flirting with that now?
We are absolutely flirting with that situation, 100%. There's no question about it. And it's, again, stuff that you think of, when you think of like giant moments in history, when you think of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and all of that stuff, you think of these moments as moments of a far long gone past, and the idea that we have evolved well beyond it. But again, you are talking about a country, I hate to keep repeating this, but it bears repeating, in which there are camps in which Palestinians are being raped and people riot in defense of the rapists, and Israeli government ministers argue in defense of systematic rape of Palestinian prisoners. That's the kind of country that you're talking about. Those are the people who are currently in power in Israel. And I'm sorry, when you have that kind of lunacy in government, you can't put anything beyond them. And you can absolutely see a chain of events in which Iran and Hezbollah do respond in some kind. Netanyahu takes that as justification to expand the war. He expands it. And through that gradual escalation, you do come to a point of mass devastation in both Israel and in Lebanon and maybe in Iran as well. And what's the logical outcome of that? If you keep going, and if Israel starts watching its major cities getting obliterated in the same way that they are obliterating the major cities in other countries, do they actually push that red button, and do they use their nuclear weapons?
Is war with Iran inevitable? Is war with Hezbollah inevitable? We are on the absolute brink of having that happen. So I had a very long, detailed, deep conversation about this with an expert on the issue, Omar Badr. You don't want to miss it. So sign up below on Substack. If you pay $5 a month, you get the video of every interview and you get it a day early. Or you could also sign up for free and just get the audio podcast when it drops a day later. So do yourself a favor and sign up below. Thanks, guys.